I'm Terry Futrell. We're located here in Coalfield now. I grew up in this community just north of Highway 62 here. I wrote a book about growing up here in Coalfield called Coal Dust. It basically covers the period from the end of World War II all the way up until the mid-1960s. During that time period, this community went through a lot of change. Everything was fairly primitive at the end of World War II. No electricity, certainly no city water. Most people had dug wells. The roads were all gravel. It was just a different lifestyle back then, and very primitive. Most young people today could never relate to it. I grew up in that and saw a lot of change. Went from no electricity all the way up to the point where we put men on the moon, and all in a matter of 25 years. So there was a lot of change. Coalfield changed from a mining community to basically a bedroom community for Oak Ridge. Well, the very first chapter talks about all of the changes that took place in Coalfield and how things were in the beginning. Like, we're now standing on the premises of Mount Carmel Cumberland Presbyterian Church. When I was a kid, there was a white frame church that stood over here, and in the bell tower of that church was a bell that was rung before every service. But the thing that was special about that bell was that when someone in the community died, they tolled the bell once for every year of that person's age. Well, when the old church was torn down and this new structure was built, they preserved the old bell here in this special tower that was built for it. And just as recently as 2000, when my mother died, this bell was rung just before her funeral, once for each of her 84 years. And I talk about that in the book and the impact that had on me. Other stories in the book talk about some of the older people that lived in this community as you go back the road here, back towards the foot of the mountain. For example, Marion Justice, who lived to be over 100 years old, was born at the beginning of the Civil War, lived through the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and lived through the invention of the phonograph, the first flight by the Wright brothers, a century of history. And I live just 300 yards or so away from his home, and he was a treasure to the community. And there's things about him. Another one of the older folks who lived just back up behind the church here a little bit was Lizzie Peters, a saintly woman who lived to be quite old, and she had a tremendous impact on me in the church here where I grew up. Other stories talk about, if you can see in the background, the mountain, and there's lots of woods back in here. That was our playground when I was growing up. Creeks ran through this area. We were always playing in the creek, catching crawdads and so on. There were no video games, very few toys. You simply couldn't afford them back in those days. And so there's a lot of stories in here about things we did as I was growing up. When I was a kid, there simply weren't any paved roads around here. The road that you see right in front of you was all gravel. One of the stories in the book talks about James and Margaret Bunch, who had such an influence on me. He was my high school science teacher. They lived in the house that you see right up there in the background. Back up behind their house, you see the woods up there on the ridge. That was one of our favorite play areas. Probably one of the biggest events of my growing up here in Coalfield was when Dolly Parton came to town. And it was when I was in high school, and as a matter of fact, Dolly has several relatives who lived in Coalfield, and but she came to perform at a fundraiser that our Beta Club had at the school, and brought two of her sisters with her, Stella and Casey, and they came from Sevierville to Oliver Springs on a bus and stayed with some of the relatives here, stayed overnight when we had the show, and we packed the gym at Coalfield for that show. And they charged us $10 total. And out of that, they bought 3 round-trip tickets from Sevierville to Oliver Springs. That's just phenomenal, and it gives me a deep appreciation for how far Dolly has come. We had similar backgrounds. Those of us who grew up over here in this mining camp area, by today's standards would be considered living in poverty, but we never viewed life that way. You could always look and find someone who was worse off than you, and so I talk about those kinds of things in the book. It gives you, I think, a much better appreciation for how life was 70 years ago. Beginning in April, I'm going to be doing something very special with the Morgan County Today newspaper. Twice each month, we'll be printing a chapter out of my book, Coal Dust. There's enough chapters to cover an entire year, so it will be a special feature in the paper. And for those who haven't been able to buy the book, and over a period of a year, we'll be printing the entire book, chapter by chapter. And one thing that's unique about the book is that each chapter stands alone. While they're basically chronological in the book, each chapter tells a separate story and stands by itself. So if you happen to miss one or two, you haven't missed a lot, and you can pick right back up. So we're looking forward to a full year of presenting the contents of this book to the people of Morgan County.